and he said that it must be the 27th because if you read the Surah Al-Qadr, Inna anzalnahu fi laylatil qadr, and you count the words up to here, Salamun hiya matla'il fajr. So if you count the words up to here, here is the 27th word. So he said that based on this, he thinks it is the 27th. Of course, you might say that his conclusion is far-fetched, because there's no reason just because you reached it here. But there is something nice about the way in which he reaches that conclusion, in that he says, okay, it's Salamun here and here, 27th, right? You're counting 1, 2, 3, here, Sabat Ishrin, right? So he counts it that way, and he arrives at, it is 27. That's how he's thinking. But of course, yes, his conclusion was far-fetched. But you see that there are some attempts, and there were initial attempts, but without the counting tools, they could not really make advances in this area. Today, we can make advances. If you go to the Concordance of Fuad Abdul Baqi, for example, that I mentioned earlier, you can just open the book and go to find how many times the name Isa alayhi salam is mentioned in the Quran. You will find that it's mentioned exactly 25 times. Now go to Adam, our forefather, and ask how many times is Adam mentioned in the Quran by name. That's also 25 times. Now what is the relationship between Adam and Isa? Why is each mentioned 25 times? In the Quran, in Surah 3, Surah Al Imran, in verse number 59, Allah Subhanahu Wa Ta'ala says, Inna mathala Isa inda Allahi ka mathali Adam. Certainly the example of Jesus with God is as the example of Adam. خَلَقَهُ مِن تُرَابٍ ثُمَّ قَالَ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُونَ. God created him, Adam, from dust, and then said to him, be, and he was. So what the Quran is emphasizing there in its message is that God considers both Jesus and Adam to be similar. God created them both, as opposed to those who are claiming that Isa alayhi salam is somehow God because he did not have a father. So the Quranic answer is there. And that's the message. That's all that people needed to know from reading the Quran. But today, by looking at the concordance, we can see that there is another way in which Jesus is like Adam in the sight of God. Because in God's book, each is mentioned exactly 25 times. 25 times Jesus, 25 times Adam. What about man and woman? The Arabic word for man, rajul, is mentioned 24 times in the Quran, and for woman, imra'a, is mentioned also 24 times. What about words that we see as contrast to each other? Let's say shaitan and malaika. How many times is covering a plan here in the Quran that's not the plan of any human being? We are looking at design, and that calls for a designer. And the designer, obviously, is Allah Azza wa Jal. To continue very quickly, and then I'll go to your questions. Along the same lines, we can notice that the word for month, shahr in Arabic, occurs in the Quran exactly 12 times. And again, these are scattered throughout the Quran. So why 12? God alone knows, but we can see obviously that there are 12 months in a year, and probably that's why it's mentioned exactly 12 times. And by the same token, we notice that the word for day, yawm in Arabic, in the singular, occurs in the Quran exactly 365 times. Exactly 365 times. Now, when I mentioned this in the past, some people ask, well, why not 354? Because that's the lunar calendar with which we are familiar with and which we use to regulate our religious observances. Well, we can answer by saying that both are acknowledged by God. In fact, both the sun and the moon are created by God. And God created these لِتَعْلَمُوا عَدَدَ السِّنِينَ وَالْحِسَابِ, that you may know the reckoning of the years and the calculations. So both the sun and the moon are important for such calculations. By the moon lunar cycle, we know the passing of the months, but by the solar cycle, we know the passing of the seasons. Farmers, of course, have to pay attention to the lunar cycle, to the solar cycle, because this is what regulates the 4 seasons in the year. So both are created by God. And it is interesting that in the story of the people of the cave, in Surah 18, God says that they stayed in the cave 300 years, wasdadu tis'a, and add 9. So why is it put in this curious way? Why didn't they just say 309? Why did it say 300 and add 9? Because in fact, both 300 and 309 apply. It's 300 solar years, and 309, if you want to make it lunar years, you add 9. Because 309 lunar years are approximately 300 solar years. So both are acknowledged in the Quran. So the fact that the Quran uses the word for day 365 times precisely, that is remarkable to say that this occurred only by coincidence. So all of these things we have mentioned are just coincidence or by a plan. And finally, land and sea are contrasted in the Quran. For example, in the verse from Surah Al-Rum, ظَهَرَ الْفَسَادُ فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ بِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِي النَّاسِ. Corruption has occurred on land and sea because of what human hands have done. How many times does the word for land occur in the Quran, either bar or yabis? 13 times. How many times does the word for sea occur in the Quran? Bah, 32 times. What's the relation between 13 and 32? 13 to 32 is the approximate ratio of land to water on the surface of the globe, since there is about 28% land and 72% water. 13 to 32, you can work that out. 13 and plus 32 is 45. 13 over 45, you figure the rest. So that's 28%. So finally, I believe that this sort of information, which we are discovering now, prove in a very conclusive manner, as much as an ancient book can ever be established to be a divine writing, to be the Word of God. To me, we have very clear evidence. And in fact, I have only touched on the surface of the kinds of studies which have been done regarding this whole area of the mathematical miracle of the Quran, what might be referred to in Arabic as al-i'jaz al-adadi lil Quran al-Kareem. And more information about this can be found by visiting a website, www.islamnoon.com. That is a website put up by the Noon Center for Quranic Studies in Palestine. If you have any more questions, I'd be glad to answer them for you. We have, I think, about 10 minutes or so. Shukran jazilan. Assalamu alaikum.